Hi everybody! Welcome to Rémanence, the words that linger in your mind long after you've turned the page. A podcast brought to you by Dreamcore Station. I'm your host, Charlotte, and today, for the first episode of this season, we are going to talk about the importance of research and second-guessing what you read with the example of the book Mutant Message Down Under by Marlo Morgan. For the sake of keeping it short and sweet, I'm on my own today for this recording, but if you speak French, there is another version of this episode, recorded in French, with my friend Adélie, who was the one who actually lent me this book, so I could read it. While my intention about this book and how I want to approach it will be basically the same through both versions, the French one takes the shape of a discussion between my friend and I. As she gives her feedback and impressions, I expose my research to her. This English version is recorded much later, without her feedback, and I had the time to go deeper into Aboriginal religious systems. I got the English version of the book in my hands, and now I feel even less willing to give this book a positive review, so I won't spend too much time talking about the story itself, and instead go straight for my main points of contention. Just to be clear, all my suppositions in this episode are alleged and deduced from my own mind and from reading some books and some content I sourced from the internet. All my sources will be linked in a document available in the description of this episode if you want to check them out for yourself. While I disagree with certain points of the book, and that I may express disagreement against those points, I don't have the intention to slander the author nor her work, and I don't encourage any slandering or bullying behaviors towards her or her work. The points made about Australian people, westernized Australia, European colons descent are general and in no way intended to slander any group or specific person or put a specific blame on them, nor on the Australian government in any way, shape or form. I agree that the Aboriginal people described in this book may exist, and my points are in no way intended to dismiss the living experience of actual people living the way they are. My doubts about the authenticity of this book were only raised by the lack of evidences presented in their favor, or in the favor of the material of the book. I strongly encourage every listener to take multiple sources in consideration when trying to form an opinion on anything, to be honest, to not take any words at face value, and to second-guess even the theses that match your taste. Maybe those one even more. You might learn a thing or two. I clearly did learn a lot on this one. The reminder was powerful enough to make me talk about a book that I don't really agree with on my very first essay on this channel. So yeah, grateful for the lesson and the opportunity to grow, I guess. So yeah, let's get into it. So, just a few words about the book. Mutant Message Down Under is a novel written by the American author Marlo Morgan, self-published in 1991 and signed with HarperCollins Publishing Limited in 1994. To give you a brief summary of this book, the story is about an American woman who came to Australia on a work visa to do some kind of social work, and she suddenly received an invitation to meet a specific group of Aboriginal people, just talk about her work in general. Little did she know that she was actually invited by this small group who call themselves, quote, the real people, unquote, to go with them on an impromptu 3-month-long walkabout across the Australian desert, which was very far from her original plans. Nonetheless, she accepts the challenge and starts her journey with this strange group, learning bit by bit about their customs, their philosophy, and about herself and the world in the process. This summary describes a story nothing really out of the ordinary. Maybe the setup might feel a bit thrilling or new for a Western audience, not used to hear about Aboriginal people and Australia a lot, except for maybe memes about how big the spiders are over there. So yeah, the whole thing about this book is not really about the content itself, as fictions are by essence not mandated to tell any truth. But what raised here a few eyebrows and many voices was the way it was advertised and distributed, because this fictional account is actually unclear and deliberately kept that way in order to sell it to the audience as maybe a genuine experience, while keeping their feet dry from court cases. As a reader, advocating for transparency and authenticity, I found that this book is, for me at least, the perfect case study to show how necessary it can be to not take everything you read at face value, and the importance of using different sources and materials before making an opinion. In that spirit, I include myself, and you don't have to take me for my words either. So I prepared a document for you with all the sources I used to make this episode that you can check out if you want. Aside from the book in question and another I bought out of curiosity, everything is free to access and readable for non-specialists as myself. So yeah, grab your best detective hat and let's dive in. So, before we get into the book itself, how can we quickly assess the authenticity of a book, or any material to be honest? I'll just throw here some bullet points in no specific order, just to give you an idea of how my thought process went when I tried to give the book an examination. First of all, and this you can check even if you don't have the book with you, checking out the author. Who wrote it? What are their origins, their biography, their available opinions online, their online presence, interviews or speech that they could have give at some point. Anything basically can be useful to get a sense of their character as a person, and not just about fact in their book, because those, quote, facts would also be very influenced by their cultural context. In the same vein, checking out the context in which the work was created. What original language, what country, what was the contemporary history at that time, possible inspirations, predecessors, opponents maybe, or friends. And those 2 points, you can absolutely check them out without having the book in your hands. So it can also be a good indicator of if you want to read the book or not. Those points can give you a sense of how or why the idea of the work was born, who was the audience at the time, how was the market, was it mainstream, was it counterculture at the time, stuff like that. And then, for when you read, for when you have the work in your hands, you can also take notes on concepts, historical mentions, the author's opinions, so you can go back to it later. Once you're done, you can check, of course, chapter by chapter if you want, depending on the length of the work or your intention. But yeah, when I'm finished with either the work of a good chunk of it, I would go back to each point I outlined or bookmarked, looking for commonalities and start my research from there. The content of your research and its accessibility will greatly depend on what you're looking for, of course. In any case, I would insist on looking at diverse sources and to look for both similarities and disparities. All of that to get a general idea of the authenticity of the concept, how it was received. Is it acknowledged? Is it considered relevant nowadays? Stuff like that. And then I repeat the process as many times as necessary. Also, you don't have to outline the bulk of your research just from the book. Maybe during the research, you will come across some points that you didn't even suspect that could be linked or that you were ignorant of. Those also can become new starting points for your research. Depending on the work, I would stop when I feel that I have a good sense of the context and of the ideas presented in the work. It's not as hard as it can be tedious, in my opinion. I know, you don't have to gather 3 thesis material every time you crack a new spine open. You are the master of your own work ethics. I'm not here to judge, and I probably won't present to you a perfect piece either. I just wanted to outline my research process, which is very basic and common, I guess, but nonetheless effective. Even if it's simple, I found it very important to apply this kind of process even to trivial books like this one. This book is not very extreme or very opinionated, so I found that it's the kind of book that would have been really easy to gloss over and never look into its context. Without research, I would maybe even have recommended it. But from my actual standpoint, I'm glad I did my research on this, because with this one, it goes deeper than just the story. In that case, not taking interest in the context of the book may have affected my behavior, my thoughts, my speech, and affect actual people and communities. For the sake of not making a 4 hours long deep dive, I'll just get through the main contention points there seem to be with this book, but I won't go into every little details. I don't want to slander the author with too many allegations, so I will just give you a starting point of how I began my research. My first impression of the book was that it was pretty average, to be honest. Maybe a bit basic, but one thing I did was also take this first impression and box it for a while, so I could look deeper into the story. Let's take a look at the setup. The main focus of this book is the journey of our protagonist, the American woman, with occasional flashbacks leading back to her starting point or presenting diverse observations on her life in westernized Australia. When we follow her during her actual journey, the writing is focused on her observations and interactions with the group she is traveling with, who call themselves, quote, the real people. She makes mental notes, both on some details of their daily life, but also on the almost casual miracles that seem to come to them easily. She also tries to make sense of their philosophy and practices, and she tries to participate in any way she can or is allowed to. The people, on their hand, are pretty much always friendly with her and accepting of her, despite of her Western clumsiness, I would say, and they patiently teach her their ways by guiding her through some experiences and help her to participate. While nothing is inherently wrong with this setup, the descriptions of this Aboriginal group became from the get-go a great point of contention, because while containing some perishable mentions of well-known Aboriginal culture and religions, such as the mention of the Dreamtime, or maybe some health practices, some of the characteristics of the group were immediately flagged as incorrect by some sociologists and anthropologists specialized in native Australian Aboriginal culture, and those people were pointing at actual verified sources from their field when making those contestations. For an untrained eye, I can understand the appeal of the people she describes, and I can understand why so many casual and open-minded readers may have just taken her words at face value, while enjoying the entertainment of reading about this journey. The book has, in my opinion, kind of a new age vibe, like talking about divine oneness, being close to nature, coming back to the essential, stuff like that. All of those points may also be very appealing to a certain audience. I agree. Also, the author puts herself in kind of a good light as a messenger of a dying culture, but also a victim almost, as a lonely defender of the oppressed and of their dying philosophy that we ought to preserve in our hearts, but while implying that Westerners are too greedy, too Western, too imperialist, to actually care and help preserve this culture. That is what is kind of implied, and that she is fighting the good cause, in a way. I mean, she's not exactly wrong that the imperialist behaviors of most Western civilizations, but she's not really using it to actually advocate for actual Aboriginal people, and she still participates in the imperialist culture in many ways. So I find it to be a bit two-faced, I would say. So those people she describes are indeed quite interesting in their own way, while I can also argue that you could find some other more interesting books on the subject. Let's say that it's fine for a work of fiction. Okay, but the position as a work of fiction is the heart of the problem. That's the tricky part. Because this is described as a work of fiction. It's not because it was intended to be a fiction from the very beginning, but it was only claimed as a fiction and a novel later on, with the argument to protect the very people she's mentioning in the book and their whereabouts. But at first, and this is where the research part begins, when it was still self-published, it was introduced to the public as an autobiography, the storytelling of her actual experience that she had lived. And even in the contracted book, the HarperCollins version, and even in my French book, it was also heavily pointed in the book that you could also, if you want to, take the fiction as reality with only slight modifications to not be able to identify real people. And that she had really experienced this kind of journey during her stay in Australia. And it was also hinted as well, directly in the same paragraph, that she was almost giving you the grace of saving you from a trip to the library. Maybe you can go to the library, but yeah, if you just read her book, it's almost the same as just consulting hundreds of pages of knowledge and data on the culture she's talking about. Yeah, she said that. And it's not just me reading between the lines. Just to quote the introduction of this book, or the first words from the author to the reader, quote, "This book is a work of fiction inspired by her experience in Australia," unquote. So yeah, at first we had the autobiography, but that mention was removed at a later date because it was suspected that the experience that she claimed true was in fact impossible to be true, allegedly false and even harmful by spreading misinformation about Aboriginal groups. It was also suspected that the story, while claiming to advocate for Aboriginal people, was only made up as a marketing strategy to support the company she worked for at the time, selling essential oils. Allegedly, the first copies would have contained advertisement for the company and their products. The self-published book got signed at some point with HarperCollins Publishing, and later on, with the success of the book in the United States, she also sold the movie rights to United Artists, I believe. While complaints were voiced from the very beginning, this last announcement, the movie rights and filmmaking announcement, triggered a stronger opposition, and several Aboriginal elders, as representative of Aboriginal culture and activists, asked for the project to be dropped at once, as it was just considered as a personal profit to this woman, with nothing given back to the Aboriginal community, but also, in many ways, directly harmful and misleading towards the Aboriginal communities, both in the representations of their history, of their custom, and their people, as even in its current form, the work still nudges you towards believing it's telling a true story. The author has made some official apologies, stating that she never intended to harm or dismiss any Aboriginal people, so at least she did that, and the movie was never made. Her claim to protect the group of Aboriginal could have been genuine, but many people found it also very convenient for her to play on this ambivalence without providing evidences to support her story. She had also been known to throw around the racism card at whoever tried to confront her, allegedly saying that those racist people didn't believe that Aboriginal people could have been that articulate or sophisticated in their custom. All of this made it really hard at that time to get her into a real talk, I believe. For legal reasons, I also believe that the matter was settled when the book was officially stated as a work of fiction, so I leave it at that. And she also apologized for what it's worth. I find that using the racism card is quite rich in regard of other allegations of misrepresentation of actual Aboriginal people that she does. But yeah, maybe it's a symptom of its time, but when I read the book in English, I found that part of her vocabulary when mentioning Aboriginal people was either outdated or unintendedly dismissive. I'm not a native English speaker, and I don't have a lot of academic knowledge in linguistics either, so for this point, I'm mostly relying on information I found online. So, in my edition, I believe it's quite a recent one, I noticed 3 main terms that may not align with academic terms, suggesting little research made on our side, or, as I said, a symptom of our time, and maybe dismissive terms in today's light, but accepted in our time. First is the systematic reference to Aboriginal people as Aborigines, and following along because it's connected. The second would be the reference to the group as the Aborigine tribe. First problem, Aborigine, and second problem, the use of the word tribe. Maybe it's just a small detail, but in anthropology, at least today, the Aboriginal term acknowledges better the diversity of cultures and people across the whole country, while the term Aborigine references those groups as a whole. The term tribe would also be a more Western version of the ideas promoted by the terms clans and groups. Those last terms, clans and groups, being the closest to translation of Aboriginal concepts. So yeah, maybe it's just that the custom vocabulary has evolved, I can say. But the other term that was making me second-guess the work from the get-go was the mention of divine unity, oneness, or divine oneness. This one I felt quite uncomfortable with and a bit suspicious. In a wider sense, also, I didn't really board the spirituality, religion, and beliefs of the self-named real people. To me, something felt a bit off regarding their religion with the divine oneness. It's nothing scandalous, and the customs that they display in the book are nothing to be shocked by, I would say. Just daily prayers to find food, gratitude for their life in the world, prayers to heal, feeling connected with nature and animals, and purposeful, being full of respect for all living beings. All of this looks great and harmless in surface. We could also give the author the grace that she only had access to a very rough translation of the speeches, of the activities, and she would have, at that time, nothing but her memory to keep notes on her journey. But within the beginning of my very first hour of research, so not even a full evening, it was almost debunked to me that actual Aboriginal religious systems were quite far off from what was described here. She kinda gets a pass on the vague description of what is called the dream time, but yeah, at the same time, she's not giving much. But regarding other practices, I feel that her descriptions of the real people customs, the description lacks the presence of what I believe to be very key points of most Aboriginal religious systems, like the rituals, the sacred objects, the sacrality of places, the initiations, the relations between men and women, and their place in society, their customs, and their religious life as a whole, I would say. Everything that she describes is not reflected anyway in anthropology work that I could find. I know it's a very, very big country, but at the same time, anthropologists have found some very similar variations of the same concepts. Maybe just the gods are not named exactly the same, or they have a slightly different myth attached to them, stuff like this. While in most Aboriginal religions, some creator gods or what is called all-fathers figure still exist, it's pretty far from this new agey way of talking about a divine oneness, as it wouldn't have been referred to in that way in most Aboriginal systems. No mentions either of sacred and profane, no rituals. The real people have equality between men and women. So yeah, the love and respect for all forms of life is real also here in many ways in Aboriginal systems, but here it feels more like a love and light concept and kind of spirituality, and not really the kind of sacredness I get from reading an anthropology book about Aboriginal culture. I feel that it also leans into the idea that native people are like magical fairies that we must protect, as they have such an innocent and peaceful way of living. I feel that Western culture only feels remorseful when it's pointed that they have stepped on a beautiful and rare flower. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely agree and support the apologetic behavior of renewing interest in those native cultures. They are very precious and important as part of humanity, and also respecting and acknowledging the grief and the losses of all the culture that imperialist Europe has stepped on. So my problem is not with that part. Of course, we have to protect and help elevate the Aboriginal culture. But I feel that in this specific point, she's not even talking about real Aboriginal people. She's talking about protecting some people that she found whimsical maybe, or spiritually aligned with their own principle, and not the principles of Aboriginal religions, actual Aboriginal religions, that may have been harder to understand as a Westerner. I understand that there is still a slight chance that those real people may exist as they are described to be, but I also understand that many anthropologists are currently the only side backing their work with evidences and studies and data. I won't go too far into describing the specificity of those studied religious systems, so I will let the professionals explain their own work, but I strongly encourage you to research on your own if you want to know more about it, because it's truly fascinating. Talking about real people as in more alive and connected with the world isn't really harmful as a concept when compared to Western and disconnected mutants. But I also find it strange that such a humanist group would be so binary and would alienate everyone who is basically not one of them. Not every non-real people is Western. What about other natives in the world, victim of imperialism? What about other native Australians like them? Are they not real people? Are they not real and connected? If they don't believe in a divine oneness? I'm pushing a bit my questions, but because if you take it just as a fictional account, it just looks maybe a bit naive, maybe entertaining, maybe comforting in its own way. But to me, it's also clear how harmful it can be to actual Aboriginal groups and also to other people of Aboriginal descent, severed from their origins while having such difficulties to integrate in the westernized community. This book doesn't really look like a truthful telling of Aboriginal customs either, aside from some maybe gastronomical customs and the oil she is trying to sell. It's almost more of a tale tailored to be palatable for the uneducated American or Western taste, and not a true story about actual Aboriginal people. I feel that it's the very reason why so many people, among them, Aboriginal elders or activists, raised their voice at the time against the project, both the book and the movie project. Because to them, it seems like a fable, and it's not talking about their true essence and stories. One of the weirdest points to me is also that, at first, the author got the support of an Aboriginal man named ℏ𝕐𝕐, who wrote a letter, still present in my book. But then, he later went back on his endorsement of the work, glared at by his community. What is so strange to me is that in the letter, he claims to be part of the real people, if I understand correctly, but in the same letter, he also identifies as belonging to the Wurundjeri community, sorry for the pronunciation, which is actually a pretty well-known, real Aboriginal tribe, currently very active and proactive even to let their culture known and protected. And from what I understand, the Wurundjeri group has never held the beliefs of the real people. They would have had more of a celestial being as a main important god or spirit, with a specific myth attached to it, and several other beings and spirits as part of the bigger myth. Nothing near the divine oneness that is described in the book. So I'm also suspicious that this man may not be one of the real people, if they exist. Maybe if we stretch it out really thin, we could have the hypothesis that it's only a limited number of people from the Wurundjeri group that went, at some point, their own way and created their own customs. Maybe. A bit stretched, I don't really buy it, but maybe. But at the same time, the guy also issued an apology and went back on his statement while still being in the book. But yeah, he went back on his statement, which sounds like a familiar pattern that we have already encountered. I will let you, once again, form your own opinion in your own time. I'll stop here for my exposé, but I noted many of the points that I could also have spent whole episodes on, like how the naming of the characters and behaviors are reminding me of archetypal Native American depictions, or maybe I could have talked of how hard specialists were face-palming, even more than I did, at the depiction of Aboriginal customs. I also found an article second-guessing the entire doability of the journey itself, how it was questionable in the first place, or that it was almost impossible to not encounter any human being for 3 months straight, even in the desert, stuff like that. So many more points to explore, but not today. To conclude this episode, why I went through such great length to talk about a book I suspect to not be entirely genuine is to show how putting actual interest and research into what you read can literally change your perspective. In my own practice and in my life in general, I find it very important to take the responsibility of understanding what goes in my brain, because it will also influence what gets out of my mouth. Of course, it would have been easier and more pleasant maybe for me to talk about a book that I actually like. When I first picked this book as my first piece to work on, I didn't know yet where I was going to land. It was put in my hands with enthusiasm, and the title seemed intriguing, and I thought, yeah, I read before a similar kind of autobiography that I really enjoyed, and even found the book from before pretty truthful and interesting. I guess that the gap just made the research part even more eye-opening, I guess. In the end, I think that this book is in fact kind of the perfect item to start with, as it allows me to lay out some of my most important personal quests and principles, because it is a work that has very precisely challenged me into staying open-minded to make space for the story and its interesting parts, but also at the same time staying wide awake and questioning the authenticity of what is presented to me. In the end, you guessed it, my balance tipped in favor of academic doubt, but still a good experience in my research. And I also learned a lot of new information about a culture I didn't know much about. So that part is softening my mood quite a bit, especially during the process of the research. So it was not just face-palming. It was also being enchanted by the Aboriginal culture and religions. So yes, this episode is not really about that specific book. It's, in a nutshell, the story of how every time I pick a book, I'm prepared to fall in love with it, but also ready to rip it apart, without hesitation if I have to. How to keep a sense of wonder and curiosity while killing your darlings mercilessly. No darlings are for me, so it was quite an easy fit for this time. In general, I don't imply that you have to go as hard as I did with this whole book, but also maybe a quick search about the author, of their biography, of their bibliography, what other people have to say about this subject, what is the position of the author about it, how did they get interested or involved. Even with fiction, this one is a good example, as it was categorized as fiction, but it was still interesting to research it as I would have with a non-fiction book. When you go in any field, but especially around esoteric fields and workings, I feel that you really have to work on keeping balanced this duality of open-mindedness and suspension of disbelief, with keeping a sharp, critical blade ready to cut through the deceiving illusions you may encounter. In my opinion, if I have to literally shelve my brain out of my head in order to have a good and mindless time, it's to me a sign to reconsider the relationship with my own mind. I feel that if I have to switch my brain off in order to enjoy something, maybe it's not something that I want in my life, in my own opinion. But don't get me wrong, I'm not just all about being the wrathful judge of justice, sending every book either to the first row or to the pits of hell. It's not all good, it's not all bad. In the same way as you'll run in circles pretty quickly if you only go towards what you like, you will also feel like you're in a slump if you end up antagonizing everything you try out. It's all about measure. In my case, I know in my heart of hearts that I will always choose truth over sparkles. I know that I am okay with being disenchanted at times, and I know that I am willing to make the effort to go to the bottom of things, to uncover what I find maybe important to know, because I feel that in that way, I can bring more alignment and more connection in my own life. We have now reached the end of this episode. I hope you had a good time and that you still have faith in books, even after all that. I'm curious, have you read this book or heard about it? If you did, what is your opinion on it? Did you know about the scandals? I'm not a scholar per se and not very well versed on Aboriginal cultures, so if I made any mistakes in my words, please be kind enough to tell me about it so I can acknowledge it in the best way. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like, comment your opinions, share with a friend or an enemy. It's your call. You can find me on Instagram at @DreamCoreStation, where I post mainly about tarot and tarot readings. As always, everything will be linked in the description. So yeah, I wish you a wonderful day and wonderful reads.